Captain Talia Lewis adjusted her cap as she stepped off the jet bridge and into the terminal, her navy blue uniform still pristine despite the 14-hour haul from Johannesburg. And though her shoulders ached and her mind pulsed with fatigue, there was a certain pride in the way she carried herself, a quiet strength in every step as she walked toward the crew lounge, a place where she had gone dozens of times before, a space meant for rest, recovery, and a few minutes of peace before moving on to the next flight. But today something felt off. Perhaps it was the way the ground staff barely acknowledged her, or the way the terminals overhead. Lights buzzed just a little louder than usual, or maybe it was just the silence that followed her footsteps. Too quiet, too aware, and as she reached the crew lounge door, badge in hand, ready to scan and enter, a young male agent stepped in front of her with a clipboard in his hand and a stern look in his eyes, blocking the door, not rudely at first, just firm, like someone used to giving orders to people he thought beneath him, and without even asking for her credentials. He said, "This lounge is restricted, only for active flight crew and pilots," and Talia, caught off guard by the tone, took a small breath and replied, "I am a pilot," showing her ID badge clearly. But the agent didn't glance at it. Instead, his eyes scanned her face, and then dropped lower, as if trying to confirm what his brain had already refused to believe. And the pause that followed was filled with an uncomfortable mix of disbelief and something far uglier, something she had seen before in boardrooms and cockpits, and even on casual walks through unfamiliar airports. The hesitation that always came when someone saw her uniform and struggled to connect it with her skin, her gender, her presence. And though she was used to being questioned, to being doubted, to proving herself in ways her colleagues never had to, there was something about the way this agent said, "I think you're mistaken, ma'am," that made her stomach turn. And when she repeated, "I'm Captain Lewis, Delta 719 from Johannesburg," the agent blinked, glanced at his clipboard, still said nothing, then looked past her as though searching for someone more believable, someone more like what he expected a captain to look like. And she knew in that instant that he didn't believe her, that he wasn't going to let her in, not because of protocol or confusion, but because something in him simply rejected the idea of who she was and what she represented. And when he said, "You'll have to wait outside, ma'am. This area is for senior flight staff only," something in her mind clicked, not in anger, not in frustration, but in a deep, sharp clarity, that this wasn't about a mistake or a one-off moment. This was about a system, a pattern, a silence that too often swallowed these things whole and let them slide under the rug of discomfort and plausible deniability. And though she didn't raise her voice or argue, though she didn't flash credentials or call for a supervisor, though she simply said, "Okay," and turned around, her heartbeat was louder than the terminal buzz, her grip on her flight log just a little tighter, and as she walked away, she didn't think about rest anymore, didn't think about catching her next assignment, or even the bitter taste of coffee she craved. She thought about how many times this had happened before, not just to her but to others like her, pilots who had earned their wings through sweat and sleepless nights, only to be dismissed by someone with a clipboard and an ego. And by the time she reached the escalator, she was already making a call, not to the agent's supervisor, not even to the airline's HR department, but to someone higher, someone who owed her a favor, someone who once told her that if anything ever crossed the line, he wanted to know. And the words she used were simple, calm, and devastating. She said, "I was denied access to a secure lounge today by your staff because the agent didn't believe I was a captain, and I believe this reflects a deeper systemic issue." And the man on the other end went quiet, not out of disbelief, but out of understanding, because he had known Talia for over a decade, had watched her climb through the ranks, survive loss, discrimination, and near burnout to earn her wings. And he knew if she was calling him directly, she wasn't bluffing. And what followed over the next 72 hours would uncover things that had been buried under years of silence, quiet complaints that had been ignored, security reports that hinted at racial profiling, whistleblower emails that were never forwarded. And by the time the internal investigation began, 3 names had already surfaced, including the agent at the lounge, his supervisor, and a regional manager who had allegedly blocked prior complaints from reaching higher levels. And Talia wasn't looking for revenge. She wasn't even asking for an apology. What she wanted was truth. What she wanted was accountability. What she wanted was to make sure that the next black woman captain, or any captain who didn't fit, The mold wouldn't be made to feel invisible in a space they had earned the right to enter. And while the airline scrambled to contain the growing PR nightmare, the media caught wind of the story. Not because Talia leaked it, but because someone from within the company had had enough. And when the article broke with the headline, "Black Captain Denied Lounge Access by Airline Staff," it wasn't just the story of one woman's experience. It became a mirror reflecting the rot beneath the polished surface of the industry. And as public outrage grew, the Federal Aviation Administration stepped in to audit the airline's conduct protocols, citing not only this incident, but a growing list of anonymous reports from employees across the country. And while the airline issued statements of concern and promised reform, Talia remained quiet. She didn't speak to reporters, didn't post online, didn't give interviews. Instead, she went back to work, flew her next flight, completed her duties, and walked past the same lounge again, this time not to enter, not to prove anything, but to remember what had started here, how a closed door became an open investigation, how a moment of silent refusal led to voices being heard across an entire industry. And as she passed by the desk where the agent had once stood, now empty, she glanced at her reflection in the lounge glass, standing tall, composed, and quietly victorious, not for herself, but for every person coming after her who would walk through that same door without question, without pause, without the sting of doubt buried beneath politeness, because that door, once shut, was now wide open. 3 days after Captain Talia Lewis walked away from the lounge without saying another word, the air inside the executive offices of the airline headquarters was anything but calm. Beneath the polished floors and framed awards lining the corridors, tension brewed like a storm behind smiling press releases and crisis. Management scripts, the boardroom where the emergency meeting was held, had thick walls and thicker egos as department heads shuffled in clutching printouts and reports, not all of them knowing why the meeting had been called, but all sensing the gravity of it. At the far end of the room stood Miles Hart, the airline's vice president of operations, whose usually steady voice had taken on an edge over the last 48 hours, because despite the PR team's efforts to spin the lounge incident as an unfortunate misunderstanding, the internal review had turned up more than anyone had anticipated, and now a far more troubling picture had begun to emerge. The kind of picture that couldn't be explained away by human error or isolated bad behavior. It started when someone anonymously forwarded a bundle of emails to Miles, messages that stretched back to years. Some flagged by HR but never escalated. Others written by junior crew members who described a pattern of subtle but persistent discrimination at specific regional airports, including complaints about being misidentified, denied secure access despite proper credentials, being referred to dismissively by rank, or quietly pulled aside for additional security checks even, while their white or male counterparts passed freely. The language in these messages wasn't always angry. Sometimes it was almost apologetic, almost hesitant, as if the writers weren't sure if what they'd experienced was worth reporting. And yet, when Miles laid them all out in sequence, printed and time-stamped, it was impossible not to see the common thread running through them. It was the same thread that now wrapped itself around the company like a noose, and with every new document that surfaced, with every personnel file that revealed how complaints were dismissed with notes like resolved verbally or no action needed, the thread only grew tighter. And what made it worse was that many of these incidents centered around a handful of airport stations, Las, Miami, places where regional managers had built little kingdoms of autonomy, often ignoring directives from corporate in favor of quiet control. And as the meeting began, Miles stood silently for a moment, letting the room settle, letting the hum of whispered speculation die down before he spoke. When he finally did, his voice was calm but stripped of its usual pleasantries. He said, "We have a problem. And it's not just what happened to Captain Lewis at Gate C-24. It's what that moment exposed, what it connects to, and the culture it reflects." And as he walked them through the findings, slide by slide, redacted, email after email, blurred employee photos, cross-referenced timelines, the room began to shift from disbelief to discomfort, because it was now clear that what had happened wasn't a one-off mistake by a lounge agent. It was part of a wider pattern of unchecked bias, operating under the radar of corporate oversight, and someone in the room, a director from HR, finally asked, "Are we talking about discrimination claims, or are we talking about something bigger?" And Miles replied, "We're talking about a systemic failure, a breach of operational trust, and potentially a federal investigation," because the FAA was already on the phone, asking questions, requesting files, and hinting at temporary restrictions. If the airline couldn't prove it had maintained a non-discriminatory protocol in its employee practices and secure areas. Meanwhile, Talia had returned to her apartment in Seattle, quietly, away from the spotlight, having declined every interview request and media appearance, not because she didn't care, but because she understood the weight of silence when used with precision. Instead, she reviewed a folder of documents she had begun collecting 2 years ago, long before the lounge incident, notes she had kept of subtle slights, strange delays in promotion approvals, odd performance reviews that contradicted her flight records. And now she wondered if all of those moments were random or if they were, in fact, part of the same network of quiet resistance that seemed to resent her position, her competence, her presence. And though she had always believed in professionalism over outrage, she also believed in patterns, and this one was becoming clearer by the hour. She wasn't just the victim of one employee's prejudice. She had walked into the heart of a system built to protect appearances while quietly excluding difference. And elsewhere, someone else was watching everything unfold from a distance, sitting in a small apartment in Chicago, with a laptop open, and a file labeled DL Internal Records 2021 to 2024 sitting on the desktop. The woman's name was Aisha Clark, a former HR analyst for the airline who had left quietly last fall after being passed over for promotion 3 times despite glowing reviews. She had once filed an internal report flagging inconsistencies in employee feedback records and unexplained deletions in digital complaint logs. But her report had never made it past her manager, and shortly after, she was asked to take a lesser role or resign. She chose to resign, but not before copying certain files that she now realized were more valuable than she'd thought. And as the news of Talia's incident broke, she felt a strange mixture of rage and relief. Rage that it was still happening, relief that maybe, finally someone would listen, and so she wrote an email. Subject line, Captain Lewis's incident, internal documentation available. And she sent it not to a news outlet, but directly to the FAA officer, whose contact had appeared in one of the early leaked stories. And in that email she included just enough proof to get their attention. Not all of it, just enough, including a memo from 2022, in which a regional manager had explicitly suggested that crew lounge access should be handled with visual discretion. A phrase so vague, yet so damning, it sent shivers through the FAA's review team. Within hours, a quiet alert was sent to the Department of Transportation, and by the next morning, the airline received formal notification of an impending audit. Not just on its training and security practices, but on its HR record-keeping, employee treatment, and access equity protocols. And the man who had originally told Talia to call him if anything ever crossed the line, the same man she had phoned just days ago, was now sitting in his office, knowing that the line hadn't just been crossed, it had been erased and redrawn, beneath the feet of hundreds of employees who had no idea they were walking through a system rigged against them. Meanwhile, the agent who had denied Talia entry was now suspended, his name withheld from public release but internally flagged, and during his initial interview with the audit team, he had insisted he was just following instructions, that he didn't recognize her, that he wasn't told who was arriving. But when asked why he didn't even scan her ID, why he didn't follow protocol, he hesitated and then said something he probably didn't mean to say out loud. He said, "She didn't look like a captain," and in that single sentence, the weight of his intent collapsed all his defense, because there it was, the bias, not shouted, not written, but lived and spoken, unfiltered, and it was enough. The investigation began to widen, and inside the airline, a whisper campaign began to form. Pilots messaging each other under private forums, group chats lighting up, people sharing their own stories, things they had kept to themselves for years, including a black first officer who had been stopped by airport security twice in one day while walking to the cockpit, and an Asian flight engineer who was mistaken for baggage crew by terminal staff despite his clear uniform and ID. The stories were endless, and as they began to surface, it became clear that Talia's experience was not rare. It was just finally visible. And yet, through it all, Talia herself said nothing publicly, choosing instead to draft a personal report, a chronological summary of not just the lounge incident but every event she could remember where bias had touched her path, from the time a captain refused to greet her properly during training, to the time she was told passengers might be uncomfortable with her on the intercom. And she didn't write it out of anger, but out of duty, because she believed that if a system is to heal, it first needs to see itself clearly, and she titled the report, Not an Isolated Case, and sent it to only one person. The CEO, who received it late in the evening, opened it, and read it all the way through without stopping, and when he finished, he didn't call her, he didn't email back, he simply walked into his next board meeting and said, "We're going to have to change everything." 5 days after Captain Talia Lewis had been denied access to the crew lounge, and 3 days after the airline had received official notice of the Federal Aviation Administration's Audit and Department of Transportation review, the atmosphere at corporate headquarters had shifted from tension to full-blown crisis management mode as internal emails increased in volume and urgency, while legal teams worked overtime to prepare position statements, past compliance documentation, and coach executives on how to handle the inevitable interviews and inquiries without admitting liability. The problem, however, was that the situation had already outgrown containment. What had started as a quiet act of bias by a single gate agent had now transformed into a story picked up by every major national outlet, from morning news programs to investigative podcasts, and though Talia had still not spoken publicly, her silence had only deepened the public's curiosity and added to the perception that what had occurred was not just personal but symbolic of something far greater. And as this perception spread, employee forums and industry insiders began sharing documents, screenshots, and testimony under anonymous handles, painting a mosaic of inequality that went far beyond one airline and touched on long-standing issues of representation, access, and dignity across aviation as a whole. And in one such private chat group, a former pilot named Jerome Caldwell, who had flown for the same airline between 2006 and 2019, began posting long-form accounts of what he described as the unspoken hierarchy within commercial aviation, a hierarchy not based on skill or hours flown or safety records but on image and conformity and silence. He described moments where he had been subtly discouraged from applying to captain roles, despite having more experience than his peers. Moments when co-workers made jokes they thought harmless but that made him feel erased. And more than that, he described the loneliness of being one of the few black pilots in the room every time decisions were being made. And though his name was not widely known, his posts began circulating and resonating, and within days major publications began quoting him, including one post where he wrote, "People don't understand that in this job we carry more than passengers. We carried the weight of proving we belong in a space that's never really accepted us." And that quote was reprinted in op-eds and viral threads, each mention turning up the pressure on airline executives to respond, not with statements but with action. And amid all of this mounting chaos sat one person who had not expected to be caught in the storm. Her name was Laura Whitmore, Director of Regional HR Compliance for the Southeastern District, and the person responsible for signing off on complaint dismissals from Miami and Atlanta and other flagged locations. For 3 years she had seen reports come across her desk, flagged emails and typed summaries from junior staff or mid-level managers, and while she had occasionally recommended further review, she had more often marked the documents for verbal resolution, not because she wanted to silence anyone but because she believed that too much escalation would attract unnecessary attention. And now, as she watched her own name appear in the leaked emails shared by the whistleblower Aisha Clark, a cold realization began to form in her gut. She was no longer a bystander to corporate routine. She was now a character in a national story, one that painted her as either negligent or complicit, and she wasn't sure which was worse. And in the middle of one sleepless night, she opened her laptop and began rereading old files. This time not as an administrator, but as a person trying to understand where she had gone wrong. And as she read complaint after complaint, she realized something she had never wanted to admit, that her role had not been neutral, that by avoiding conflict, she had enabled harm, that by dismissing discomfort, she had preserved a lie. And elsewhere, Talia sat in her kitchen with a printed copy of her Not an Isolated Case report beside her, sipping coffee she didn't even like anymore, her mind turning slowly, not just over what had happened but over what to do next, because now she understood that what she had triggered was bigger than she had ever expected. She had wanted acknowledgement, yes, but more than that, she had wanted to understand whether what she felt all these years had been real, whether the subtle dismissals and slow-track promotions and second glances had all been isolated, or if they formed a truth no one dared name. And now she knew they did. The truth had always been there, buried in memos and security footage and awkward HR meetings, and now that it was exposed, she had a choice. She could let the system handle it, or she could step forward and become a part of the shaping of what came next. And as she considered this, she received a call, a woman's voice on the other end, calm and precise. It was a producer from a national investigative series who wanted to feature her story, not just for shock value or scandal, but as part of a broader segment on systemic bias in high-trust professions, pilots, surgeons, judges, professions where people are expected to project neutrality and perfection while facing deeply unequal scrutiny. And Talia said she would think about it, but hung up, knowing the answer was already forming, not because she wanted attention but because truth was no longer optional. And in a downtown law office, the airline's legal team held another meeting, this time with the CEO present, his face tight with concern as he reviewed the newest reports, not just of public sentiment but of internal backlash. Dozens of employees were now submitting letters of concern, demands for revised training, demands for leadership changes, and at least for junior executives, had offered to resign quietly before their names reached public records. Meanwhile, the FAA's inquiry had expanded to include questions about pilot promotion policies, cockpit pairing protocols, and complaint resolution timelines, and what had started as one denied entry was now unraveling decades of corporate culture in real time. And through all of this, the CEO kept returning to one thing: Talia's report. Her language was precise, her documentation exact, her tone professional, and yet the weight of it was undeniable. It was not a rant, it was not emotional manipulation. It was a mirror held to their faces, and no one in that office could look away from it anymore. And while legal advisors debated strategy and media teams scrambled to reposition their messaging, one executive finally said what no one else dared say: maybe we need to bring her in, not as a consultant or PR shield, but as a partner in fixing this. Maybe she's the one who actually knows how deep it goes. And though the room went silent at first, the idea lingered. And later that evening the CEO made a quiet call to her, a voice message only, short and careful, saying he would like to meet in person to talk not about what had happened, but about what could happen next. And Talia listened to that message twice before deleting it. Not because she was uninterested, but because she had already started writing a new document, a framework proposal titled Access, Accountability and Repair, in which she laid out a three-phase approach to rebuilding internal trust, rewriting access training, and implementing third-party oversight. And as she wrote, she no longer felt angry or afraid, or even tired. She felt resolved, and far from corporate offices and newsrooms. In a classroom at a small aviation school, a young black woman named Kiara watched the story unfold online and felt something she had not felt since the beginning of her training. She felt seen. She had always dreamed of being a captain, but always assumed she'd have to do it quietly, without missteps, without complaint. But now she saw a captain who had walked into the fire and changed the shape of the room without even raising her voice. And Kiara wrote a note to herself that read, "You can fly and be heard," and folded it into her logbook. And across the country others did the same, pilots sharing their own small truths, employees reconsidering their silence. And in the center of it all stood a woman who had once been told she didn't look like a captain, now shaping the future of flight with every word she refused to swallow. 10 days had now passed since the incident that sparked a national conversation about power privilege, perception, and systemic discrimination within the aviation industry, and those 10 days had changed everything in ways that no one could have predicted, not even Talia, who now found herself caught in a storm that had transformed her. From a respected pilot to an unexpected icon of quiet resistance and uncomfortable truth, the airline was no longer issuing updates. They were now issuing apologies, carefully worded statements that acknowledged the hurt and committed to change, though those who had lived through the silent weight of inequality knew better than to accept promises at face value. Meanwhile, in offices across the country, government agencies continued their investigations, but something even deeper was beginning to unfold beyond the spreadsheets and audit reports. A cultural awakening was forming across flight schools, training programs, and pilot communities. Young students were asking new questions. Industry veterans were remembering old wounds, and the hierarchy of aviation, which had always been tightly guarded, was now being interrogated at every level. Talia watched it all quietly, choosing once again to let her actions speak louder than any soundbite. She declined still more media appearances, turned down publishing offers, but agreed to one thing: a closed-door panel with the Department of Transportation, where she shared her experiences not for sympathy, but to provide a roadmap of how small moments of bias accumulate into systems of exclusion. She spoke calmly without bitterness, recounting how even as she achieved milestones and broke barriers, she was still made to feel like an exception rather than a standard. She described how passengers would ask if she was really the pilot, how colleagues would second-guess her flight decisions, until proven right, how HR once told her she should dress more formally even while others wore the same uniforms she did, and when she finished speaking the room was silent, not out of discomfort, but out of the weight of truth, and those present understood that they had not just heard a testimony, they had been handed a mandate to rebuild trust with those who had too long been left to carry the burden of proving themselves over and over again. Elsewhere, the airline's CEO was moving quickly to reshape the company's image, not because it was convenient, but because he now saw that the foundation they had built was flawed, and the only way to save it was to start again. He had met privately with Talia and had asked her directly what she wanted, not in terms of personal gain but in terms of institutional repair, and she had handed him the proposal she had written: access, accountability and repair, and told him, "This isn't about me, it's about every person who's been made invisible while doing their job." And to his credit, he had listened not just with corporate politeness but with the understanding that leadership meant humility, and now changes were happening, real ones. Not just optics but policy. A new internal equity oversight board was formed with rotating external members. New procedures were rolled out, requiring all access point staff to undergo live training with real pilot testimonials and not pre-recorded scripts. Complaint handling was transferred from local HR to a centralized and monitored office, and most notably, the airline announced a scholarship and mentorship initiative named after pioneers in aviation who had been overlooked for too long, including a grant in Talia's name, though she had requested it be awarded anonymously. And as these changes were announced, something else began to shift within the ranks. Pilots who had stayed silent began speaking out, one by one sharing their stories and concerns on internal channels protected by anonymity but amplified by collective power, and among them was First Officer Dan Kim, who had served under multiple captains but remembered most flying with Talia. Early in his career, he recalled how her precision and calm had taught him more than any simulator, and he wrote in his post that watching her story unfold made him realize how blind he had been to what she endured while he had taken for granted that his uniform would always be respected, his ID always accepted, and now he wanted to do better and be better, and his message was shared hundreds of times, including by Talia herself, who had finally rejoined the internal employee network, not to defend herself but to mentor and amplify the voices rising beside hers in another corner of the country. The FAA released a preliminary summary of their findings, and while the report stopped short of criminal findings, it confirmed multiple violations of access, equality, and procedural inconsistencies across several regional stations, and recommended sweeping revisions across the entire industry. The story was no longer just about one airline. It had become a case study in what happens when silence is allowed to settle over injustice, and in that shifting landscape, new voices were rising. Aisha Clark, the former HR analyst who had leaked critical documents, was now in talks to join a federal advisory panel on workplace equity, and she, too, understood that what she had done was risky but necessary because she had once believed in the system, and now she believed in the people willing to fix it. And as all of this unfolded, Talia returned to the skies, not with fanfare or press coverage but with the quiet focus of someone who had earned her place through years of labor and still chose to serve with dignity. Her first flight back was a short domestic route, Seattle to Denver, and she arrived early in uniform, credentials in hand, and when she approached the lounge this time, the attendant looked up, recognized her without hesitation, smiled, and said, "Welcome back, Captain." And in that moment, Talia felt something shift, not in the world but in herself, a reminder that change is never clean or instant, but is made one recognition, one voice, one act of refusal at a time. And as she stepped onto the aircraft, Her crew greeted her not with awkwardness, but with quiet respect, knowing exactly who she was and what she represented. And during that flight, as she adjusted the controls, reviewed the route, and listened to the steady hum of the engines, she felt a kind of peace, not because everything had been fixed, but because something had finally been faced, and the truth once named had made it impossible to go back to the way things were. And in the weeks that followed, more stories continued to surface across industries and professions. A ripple effect sparked by the moment one pilot chose not to argue, not to shout, but simply to walk away with purpose, and hold the system accountable in silence. And among those watching from afar were students, trainees, dreamers who had always wondered if they belonged in rooms that were never built for them, and now they had an answer, not in promises but in proof, that one person with integrity could begin a reckoning. And that reckoning could become reform, and that reform could become a new reality. And as for Talia, she continued flying day after day, night after night, returning to her craft with renewed purpose. And every now and then, she would receive letters from strangers, young women, young men, people of color, people who had nearly given up, people who had felt invisible, who wrote to say they saw themselves in her not as a symbol, but as a person who had walked through fire and kept flying. And to each one, she replied, not with speeches, but with a single sentence: keep your hands on the yoke and your eyes on the horizon, because the skies belong to you too. 2 months had now passed since the incident that had ignited the most significant reckoning the aviation industry had seen in decades, and although public attention had shifted slightly as news cycles moved on and new scandals emerged, the impact of Captain Talia Lewis's quiet defiance still echoed in boardrooms, briefing rooms, and cockpit conversations all over the country. And perhaps more importantly, it had begun to shift something deeper than policy. It had begun to awaken a collective awareness in people who had never before considered the subtle ways that authority was granted, withheld, and questioned based on race, gender, and the discomfort of others. And in this new atmosphere, Talia herself had changed. Not outwardly to those who saw her in her polished uniform, checking gauges, issuing commands, guiding takeoffs and landings with the calm mastery that only years of flight could teach. But internally she was different. There was a steel resolve in her bones, a clarity in her voice that came not from anger, but from surviving scrutiny and knowing now that she did not have to prove herself to anyone anymore. And yet, even as she returned to flying regularly, logging hours, training new first officers, and mentoring those who now saw her as more than a peer, she felt the weight of a quiet question building inside her, one she hadn't yet answered in full. What was she meant to do now, not as a pilot, but as a leader in a movement she never intended to start? And that question followed her through the skies, through long-haul red-eye flights over mountain ranges and coastlines, through hotel lobbies and post-flight checklists. It waited quietly until one morning when she received a letter in the mail, not an email or a typed memo, but a handwritten letter from a retired commercial pilot named Evelyn Morales, who had flown for nearly 30 years, starting in the 1970s, when women in the cockpit were considered anomalies. And the letter was short but full of history and emotion. Evelyn wrote that she had followed Talia's story closely, and that it reminded her of the many times she herself had been told to wait her turn, to be grateful, to be silent, and how watching Talia walk away from that lounge without losing her dignity had unlocked something she thought she had buried decades ago. Evelyn ended the letter by saying, "Your courage was the landing we were all waiting for." And Talia read that line again and again, then placed the letter in the small box she kept with her logbook, where she stored her most personal mementos. And for the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to think not just about the struggle, but about the legacy and what it meant to not just survive injustice, but transform it into a platform for others to rise from. And as that realization took root, she began to shape a new idea. Not in public, not through press releases, but through quiet collaboration with the very people she had once reported to, because what she wanted now was not revenge or recognition, but reform. And she knew that lasting reform required more than viral moments. It required infrastructure. And so she began building something new alongside a growing coalition of industry experts, regulators, educators, and equity advocates. She formed the Flight Access Equity Network, a multi-tiered initiative that focused on 3 core pillars: representation, training, and repair. Under representation, the network would audit aviation training academies, regional hiring programs, and executive pipelines to identify the gaps that kept certain groups locked out or left behind under training. It would design immersive role-based empathy programs that would require every gate, agent, crew, manager, and flight supervisor to understand the lived experience of bias, not through lectures but through simulations, storytelling, and accountability metrics. And under repair, the most radical part of the plan, the network would launch a reparative justice fund that offered career support, restitution, and re-entry opportunities for those whose careers had been derailed by discrimination, subtle or overt. And as Talia presented the blueprint in a private session with federal partners, they listened with the seriousness of people who knew they were being handed a roadmap to fix something broken, not just ethically but structurally. And at the same time, something else was happening across the industry. The story of Talia had taken on a life of its own in schools. Students were writing essays about her in flight academies, instructors were including her case in ethics curriculum, and in professional forums. Pilots were no longer avoiding the topic, but actively debating the policies that had failed her and how to make sure they never failed anyone again. And yet, despite the progress, there were those who resisted, not with open hostility, but with quiet undermining. In one internal memo at a rival airline, an executive described the ongoing changes as distraction-driven overcorrections, and while the memo was quickly retracted, it was leaked and caused another surge of outrage, forcing even reluctant companies to reckon with the new standard that was forming. And in that growing spotlight, Talia was asked once more to speak, this time not on television or radio, but at the National Aviation Leadership Summit, an invitation that had never before been extended to a black woman in uniform. And she debated saying no, but her mentor, now retired Captain Elaine Cho, encouraged her to accept and use the moment, not to defend her story, but to redefine what leadership in aviation should look like. And when the day arrived, Talia stood on the stage, in front of hundreds of leaders, CEOs, regulators, trainers, policymakers, and for 20 minutes, she did not talk about herself. She talked about the cost of silence, the weight of always having to smile through erasure, and how the goal should not be to make space for a few exceptions, but to dismantle the conditions that made exceptions necessary in the first place. And when she finished, the room gave a standing ovation, but more importantly, several companies signed on to her flight access equity network. The very next day, and back at her home, Talia finally allowed herself a day of rest. She walked through the park she loved, sat beneath a tree, and thought about her father, who had first taught her to fly in an old rented Cessna before he passed when she was still in college. And she remembered how he used to say, "Fly high, baby girl, but never forget your roots." And now she understood that her roots were not just in flight, but in justice, in dignity, in quiet resistance, and in building bridges where there had once been barriers. And so, as she prepared for her next flight, not just as a captain but as an architect of change, she wrote one final note in her journal that simply said, "This isn't the end of my story, it's the beginning of all of ours." It had now been 6 months since the incident that turned Talia Lewis from a high-performing but relatively private pilot into one of the most recognizable figures in the global aviation industry. And what had started as a single act of resistance had grown into something much larger than she had ever intended or imagined. She had become a quiet force, reshaping not only how airlines operated internally, but also how leadership was defined in an industry that had for too long prioritized uniformity over inclusion. And as her flight access equity network began to expand into international airspaces, with partnerships forming across Canada, the UK, the UAE, and even parts of Asia, she found herself increasingly pulled in two directions: one, as a leader in the skies, flying routes she had always loved, and the other, as a reformer grounded in meetings, policy rooms, summits, and roundtable discussions. And that dual life came with its own kind of turbulence, because while Talia had never craved the spotlight, she now found herself standing in it more often than she wanted, and the glare was not always warm. While thousands supported her efforts and hailed her as a symbol of needed change, there were also those who questioned her motives, who accused her of bringing politics into the cockpit, who argued that the industry was being unfairly criticized, and who whispered behind closed doors that she was becoming too powerful for someone who had started out simply flying planes. And it was during one of those increasingly common closed-door advisory meetings in Brussels, where Talia was invited to speak about pilot training reforms in EU aviation programs, that she first sensed a deeper international resistance masked in politeness but rooted in institutional discomfort because, after her presentation, one high-ranking official stood up and said, "Captain Lewis, your personal journey is admirable, but how can we be sure these kinds of equity-focused initiatives don't lower our operational standards?" And there was a pause in the room, and for a moment, the old version of Talia might have felt the sting of the implication that identity and excellence could not exist side by side, but she had grown beyond needing to justify her presence. And so she looked him directly in the eyes and said, "Equity doesn't lower standards, it reveals who has always been excluded from reaching them." And as she sat back down, the room was quiet, but the momentum was clear. More countries, more leaders, more regulators were now listening, not because of media pressure, but because they were beginning to understand the cost of ignoring what had once been hidden. And in the midst of all this, Talia received an invitation that took her breath away. An international coalition was forming, one that would focus on rewriting the global aviation code of ethics, and she had been nominated not only to join but to co-chair the ethics board, a role that would mean stepping away from regular flight rotations and devoting herself almost entirely to shaping the next generation of aviation policy. And for several days she wrestled with the decision, unsure if she was ready to leave the sky that had given her everything, unsure if she could lead from the ground and still feel whole, until one night, after a long video conference with partners in Tokyo, she walked out onto her apartment balcony and looked up at the stars and realized that leadership meant knowing when to lift others and when to land long enough to build runways for those still waiting to take off. And so she accepted that role quietly without announcement and began to transition her duties, gradually training a new generation of mentors within the network and ensuring that the programs she started would not rise and fall with her name. And during that time she also found herself reflecting more deeply on what had been lost in the past 6 months' time with family, time with friends, the intimacy of silence, the joy of being just another pilot in a line of crew members and not the one everyone looked to for answers. And so she took a brief personal leave, not to travel or speak, but simply to return home to visit her mother, her sister, and the small flight school where she had first learned to fly. And when she arrived at the hangar, she was greeted not with fanfare but with the quiet hum of propellers and the soft smell of oil and leather and wind, and it reminded her of everything that mattered. And while walking along the runway, she ran into Mr. Jennings, the instructor who had first taught her how to land in a crosswind, and he looked older now, more fragile, but his eyes lit up when he saw her, and he said, "You've been flying a different kind of plane lately, haven't you?" And she smiled because he was right. Leadership is a kind of flight too. And before leaving, she sat in one of the old training planes, closed her eyes, and imagined she was 20 years old, again full of hunger and hope and fire. And in that moment she knew she was exactly where she needed to be. And when she returned to her work, her spirit felt clearer, her voice more grounded, and her mission more urgent than ever, because during her leave an incident had occurred involving a trainee pilot of color at a major European airline who had been suspended for what appeared to be procedural missteps but were in fact rooted in biased performance evaluations. And when the trainee reached out to the Flight Access Equity Network, Talia read the case herself and knew instantly this was not an isolated issue. It was a symptom of global systems that replicated exclusion, and she began organizing an emergency review board with international experts who could provide oversight and protection for trainees facing systemic bias. And while doing so, she received a call from someone unexpected, the CEO of the airline where it had all started, the one whose crew lounge denial had sparked the entire reckoning. He asked to meet privately, and she agreed, and when they sat across from each other in a quiet office in New York, he looked at her and said, "I think I finally understand what I didn't want to see before." And then he handed her a signed resolution, a permanent board-level seat, reserved for a rotating pilot equity advisor, funded and protected by the company charter, and he told her it was her legacy whether or not she accepted it personally. And as she held the resolution in her hands, she felt something release in her chest, not closure, because injustice never truly disappears, but affirmation that even slow, reluctant institutions could learn and shift if the pressure and the purpose were clear. And that night, as she sat in her hotel room, watching the city lights reflect on the window, she received another letter, this one from a girl named Amira in Kenya, who had just earned her first solo flight license, and wrote to say that when she had been the only black girl in her flight class, she had wanted to give up until her uncle showed her a video of Talia Lewis walking away from a lounge with her head held high, and a mirror ended her letter with the words, "When I fly, I carry your courage with me." And reading that, Talia understood once and for all that her work was no longer about what had happened to her. It was about what would never again happen to others, not if she had anything to say about it. And as she boarded her next flight, not as a captain but as a passenger this time, traveling to Geneva to lead the first session of the Global Ethics Committee, she looked out the window during takeoff and whispered to herself, "This is still my sky, every piece of it." And as the clouds lifted and the plane rose into the light, she closed her eyes and let the sound of the engine remind her that no matter where she landed, she would always rise again, not just for herself but for every voice that had ever been silenced, every story that had ever gone untold, and every future that was still waiting to be written. The end.